"Say hello to the sharks," whispered Felicia, her voice soft but venomous, as she gave Margaret a little shove toward the yacht's railing. Margaret's only son, Daniel, stood nearby with a fixed smile that looked more like a mask than comfort. They thought this would be the day they inherited her fortune, $3 billion earned through decades of building a technology empire with her late husband. Hours later, while Daniel and Felicia returned home to rehearse their grief for the press, Margaret would be sitting upright in her favorite armchair with something very special waiting for them. But first she had to survive. "Let me tell you," she thought grimly, "how an ordinary Tuesday ended with me plummeting into the Atlantic Ocean." At 67, Margaret still believed blood was thicker than seawater. She'd taught Daniel to ride a bike, had paid his tuition, and had held Felicia's hand at their wedding. When Daniel phoned her personally, no assistant, no secretary, inviting her for a celebration cruise to mark her recovery from hip surgery, she had felt a fragile hope. "Just the three of us, Mom," he had said warmly. "Like a real family again." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to think the coldness since Robert's death 2 years earlier had finally thawed. So she dressed carefully in her navy blue dress, the one Robert always said made her eyes look like the sea, and called a taxi to the marina. The yacht glistened like a floating palace. Daniel greeted her at the dock with a hug that felt rehearsed. Felicia stood on deck, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "Isn't she beautiful?" Daniel asked, gesturing at the boat. 42 feet of pure luxury. "We're thinking of taking her to the Caribbean next month." Margaret said nothing. The yacht had been bought with money she had given them last year for Daniel's consulting firm. $3 million, supposedly an investment. She had begun to suspect it had never reached any business account at all. The first hour went smoothly enough. The Massachusetts coastline shrank behind them as Felicia served mimosas and described plans to renovate their house. Margaret's old home, which she had signed over after Robert's death, thinking it would make life simpler. Daniel started asking questions in a casual tone about her will, the trust, whether she had thought about simplifying things. "Probate can be so complicated, Mom," he said, refilling her champagne glass with unusual enthusiasm. "We just want to make sure everything's taken care of." That was when Margaret noticed Felicia's phone angled oddly, pretending to take selfies but actually recording Margaret drinking and answering financial questions. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered the temporary power of attorney papers they had brought to the hospital, the advisor who had stopped returning calls. Setting her glass down, she said carefully, "Daniel, I'd like to go back to shore now." His mask slipped. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Mom," he said, his voice now harder. "We need to talk about your health. About your memory." "Memory issues," Margaret repeated, her voice steady though her pulse raced. "I'm sharper than both of you combined." Felicia stepped closer, her heels tapping against the polished deck. "We have it documented, Margaret. Doctors agree you're no longer capable of managing your financial affairs." Margaret stared at them both, realizing how carefully the trap had been built. They were miles from shore, no other vessels in sight. Daniel leaned forward, eyes glacial. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Sign the transfer documents, and we all go home happy." Margaret's hip ached as she rose, but her mind was crystal clear. "And if I refuse?" she asked. For the first time all day, Felicia smiled, a real smile that revealed the cruelty underneath. "Then it's a tragic accident. Elderly woman, recent surgery, probably disoriented by pain medication. These things happen at sea." Margaret felt a fresh wave of betrayal. "I raised you, Daniel. I gave you everything." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And now you'll give us what's left." Daniel pulled out a folder, his hands calm, his expression expectant. "Your signature here, Mother. Transfer of all assets for your protection." Felicia's phone recorded steadily, capturing every second. Margaret looked at the papers, then at her son's face, so familiar and yet now utterly alien. Beyond them, the Atlantic stretched vast and merciless. It was terrifying, yes, but somehow less so than the faces before her. Slowly, she shook her head. Go to hell, she said. Felicia moved behind her, lips brushing her ear. Say hi to the sharks. The shove wasn't violent, just enough to throw her off balance. Margaret tumbled into the freezing water, her navy dress ballooning as she plunged beneath the surface. She heard Daniel's distant cry. Mom! Oh God, Mom! But also caught Felicia's voice, low and calm on the phone. Yes, file the emergency petition Monday morning. She's clearly incompetent. Then the waves swallowed everything. Salt burned her throat as she fought upward, her lungs screaming. She surfaced, gasping, only to see the yacht speeding away, leaving her to the sea. Robert had taught her to swim years ago, their mornings spent racing laps together. But the Atlantic was no pool. Her shoes dragged her down. She kicked them off and fought the cold that gnawed at her bones. I will not die here, she muttered, clawing at the waves. Just then she spotted a speck on the horizon, an old fishing boat heading her way. As it drew closer, she saw a grizzled man at the helm and a boy beside him. They spotted her flailing arm and swung hard toward her. Strong hands hauled her aboard, dripping and shivering. Holy hell, lady, what happened? The fisherman demanded. His grandson, lanky and wide-eyed, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Margaret's teeth chattered so violently she could barely form words. My family, she stammered. They left me. The man, Jake Morrison, frowned darkly. We saw that yacht tearing off like the devil was on their tail. Didn't look back once. His grandson, Tyler, handed her a thermos of hot coffee. Margaret clutched it, whispering, the kind who inherit billions if I vanish. Jake radioed the Coast Guard. This is the Molly Sue. We just pulled a woman from the water, 12 miles southeast of Gloucester. She's conscious but hypothermic. Panic surged in Margaret. She grabbed his arm. No, please. Don't tell them. Not yet. Jake studied her face. Why not? Because as far as they know, I'm dead. If word gets out, they'll finish the job. Tyler glanced at his grandfather, uncertain. Grandpa, we can't just... Jake cut him off. Sometimes the right thing ain't the legal thing, boy. Jake keyed the radio again, his voice steady. Coast Guard, false alarm. Turned out to be debris. All clear. He turned to Margaret. You're safe here, at least for now. But you'd better start explaining. Wrapped in Jake's blanket, Margaret told them everything. Daniel's questions about her will, Felicia's recording, the documents, the push. Jake's expression grew darker with every word. So, they'd rather be rich orphans than broke kids with a mother. He shook his head in disgust. What kind of people do that? Margaret answered softly. Mine. Jake didn't waste time. He took her to an old friend, Mrs. Chen, who ran a modest bed and breakfast tucked in a quiet cove. Cash only, no questions, Jake said. Mrs. Chen, wiry and sharp-eyed, ushered Margaret in without hesitation. Honey, I've seen people running from all sorts of devils, she said, ladling steaming soup into a bowl. Long as you're not bringing violence to my door, you can stay. That night, while Daniel and Felicia painted themselves as grieving children on the news, Margaret sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, planning revenge. Jake agreed to be her eyes and ears. His charter boat gave him access to the marina, where he could watch Daniel's movements without drawing suspicion. But what I don't understand, Margaret said, sipping strong coffee, is how they plan to make it legal. Even if I died, there would be investigations. Jake leaned back, scratching his beard. They must have someone on the inside. A lawyer, banker, doctor. Somebody feeding them cover. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Then that's where we start. That night, Margaret listed everyone who had touched her finances since Robert's death. Her lawyer, Patricia Walsh. Her accountant, Michael Torres. Her advisor, Richard Barnes. Several trust officers. Somewhere in that chain a traitor was hiding. But first, she needed to know what public story Daniel and Felicia were weaving. Mrs. Chen's dusty old computer gave her the answers. Headlines blared. Prominent widow lost at sea. Daniel's quotes painted her as confused and fragile. Felicia had cried for cameras, clutching photos of Margaret. The obituary was already posted. The obituaries described her as beloved, but highlighted supposed memory struggles. Worse still, donations in her name were directed to the Alzheimer's Association. Margaret's jaw clenched. Even in death they spin lies. Mrs. Chen glanced up from her knitting. "You planning something special?" Margaret nodded. "Oh yes. Very special." The funeral was scheduled within days, and Margaret knew she had to see it, not to mourn but to watch them perform. Jake procured binoculars, and together they hid behind a shed in the cemetery, observing the spectacle. The casket was lavish, the flowers extravagant. Daniel and Felicia stood in matching black, hands clasped like dutiful mourners. Margaret's stomach twisted as she watched neighbors, book club friends, even her surgeon pay respects. Real tears stained real faces, while her own son lied with every handshake. "Look at them," she muttered. Jake adjusted his binoculars. "Notice who's missing." Margaret frowned. "Who?" "Your advisor, lawyer, accountant. People who should be here." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Because they're not grieving. They're complicit." After the service, Margaret and Jake slipped away. Back at Mrs. Chen's, Margaret pressed her hands flat on the table. "I need to get inside my old house." Jake hesitated. "Dangerous. They'll be watching." Margaret shook her head. "They don't live there. They kept their condo. But the utilities are still being paid. Which means someone's using it. That house holds answers, Jake." He sighed. "Then I'll drive you. But we go in quiet, and you don't take risks you can't afford." At midnight, Margaret slipped around the back door of the Beacon Hill home she had shared with Robert for 35 years. Her key still worked. The house smelled faintly of polish and new leather. The living room furniture was covered in sheets, but new pieces had been added, luxury items she never purchased. In the kitchen, the fridge brimmed with expensive groceries, not the stockpile of an empty home. Margaret's pulse quickened. Someone had been living here, and they weren't just passing through. Margaret crept into Robert's old study. The desk, once neat and dignified, was buried under documents. Legal papers, financial statements, and one chilling binder labeled the Margaret Project. Her own name reduced to a code for her destruction. She flipped through pages with trembling hands, notes of her confused moments, doctored medical records, staged incidents where she appeared forgetful. Every misstep she remembered suddenly snapped into focus as part of their plan. She took photos with the disposable camera Jake had given her, her rage steadying her hands. One document stopped her cold. A typed letter signed only MT. The timeline must be accelerated. Margaret is asking too many questions about the power of attorney. If she seeks independent counsel, everything collapses. Move to Phase 3 within 2 weeks. Margaret's stomach turned. Phase 3 was clearly her death. She stuffed the papers back into place, snapping the last picture. Just then, headlights swept across the curtains. Car door slammed. Voices carried through the entryway. Daniel and Felicia had come home. Margaret darted toward the back door, her heart hammering. From inside, Daniel's voice floated down the hall. "Do you think Dr. Peterson believed it?" Felicia laughed softly. She was crying too hard to think straight. "And what's she going to investigate?" "Mom fell off a boat." "It happens." Daniel's tone hardened. "The will. How long before probate?" Felicia answered smoothly. "Monday. Says full access to the accounts within 6 weeks." Margaret slipped into the garden, crouching behind the roses she had planted years ago. And then she heard it, the thin, wavering cry of a baby. Her breath caught. She peered toward the upstairs window. A light was on. A baby's silhouette shifted in a crib. Margaret froze. Daniel and Felicia had never mentioned children. They had insisted for years they weren't ready. "What in God's name?" she whispered. Was it their child? Or someone else's? The question burned as she crept through the shadows. She forced herself not to linger, hurrying to the corner where Jake's truck waited. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jake said as she climbed in, pale and shaking. Margaret clutched the camera. "Worse. I've seen my replacement." She told him about the baby, about the letter signed MT, about the chilling plans. Jake's brows furrowed. They never mentioned wanting kids. Always said they weren't the type. Margaret's voice dropped. "Then maybe the baby isn't theirs. Maybe it belongs to whoever MT is." Jake whistled low. "This runs deeper than greed, Margaret. Much deeper." At dawn, they visited a discreet photo shop in Gloucester where Jake trusted the owner. While the pictures developed, they sat in Jake's truck, drinking bitter coffee from paper cups. Margaret studied her notes. "They've been planning this for over a year. They staged every incident to make me look confused. But with a child involved, it means they're hiding more than money." Jake nodded. "We need leverage. Something that proves not only that you're alive, but that they're lying." Margaret whispered. "And I think the baby is that key." When the photos were ready, Margaret sifted through them. Images of documents, timelines, forged reports. She held up the picture of the letter. "MT," she murmured. "Whoever this is, they're directing the whole thing." Jake leaned close. "Recognize the initials." Margaret's mind raced. Michael Torres, her accountant. Patricia Walsh, her lawyer. Richard Barnes, her advisor. Any of them could be him if I can't trust them. I need someone outside the circle. Someone with no stake in my estate. Jake gave a grim smile. "Then we investigate." They started with surveillance. Jake docked at the marina, his casual presence drawing no suspicion. Margaret stayed hidden at Mrs. Chen's, gathering information through him. "They're meeting someone tomorrow," Jake reported one night. "Not at their condo but at your old house. Fancy car, tinted windows. I couldn't see the driver." Margaret's chest tightened. She whispered. "It has to be." She clenched her fists. "I need to see them with my own eyes," Jake frowned. "It's dangerous." Margaret's voice was iron. "So is doing nothing." The following night, they returned to Beacon Hill. From the safety of the garden hedge, Margaret watched as Daniel and Felicia welcomed a man inside. He was tall, expensively dressed, carrying a leather briefcase. When he turned, the porch light revealed him. Richard Barnes, her financial advisor of 10 years. Margaret nearly gasped aloud. "Richard," she whispered. The man who had managed her accounts after Robert's death. The one who had stopped returning her calls. Jake's jaw tightened. "Looks like you found your MT." Margaret's chest burned with betrayal. Richard, the man she had trusted with everything, was sitting in her study with her son, plotting her destruction. She strained to hear through the window. Richard's voice carried faintly. "Once probate begins, the assets flow smoothly. But keep her death narrative strong. Any doubt, and the court delays the release." Felicia replied coldly. "Don't worry. Everyone believes she was confused. The baby seals the story, proof she wasn't in her right mind." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Baby." Again. Margaret pressed closer, desperate to catch more. Richard lowered his tone, but she caught fragments. Custody papers, guardianship, inheritance shift. Then laughter. Daniel's voice. "By the time anyone asks questions, it'll be too late." Margaret backed away, trembling. The baby wasn't theirs, it was bait, a tool, maybe even an heir tied to the estate. He turned to Jake. "We have to get proof. Not just documents, pictures, recordings." Jake nodded grimly. "Then we'll get them." Over the next week, Margaret and Jake devised a plan. Jake borrowed recording equipment from a friend who did local journalism. Margaret studied Richard's patterns. He visited the house twice more, always at night, always carrying documents. Meanwhile, news outlets continued to praise Daniel and Felicia's devotion. Margaret watched clips online. Her son's tearful interview, Felicia's trembling voice describing her confused mother. Oscar-worthy, she muttered bitterly. But the curtain's going to fall. Mrs. Chen patted her arm. Patience, child. Revenge is best when served precise. One evening, Jake managed to plant a small recording device under the study's window ledge. That night, they listened from his truck as Richard's voice came through clear. Once the guardianship papers are finalized, the child inherits under Margaret's trust. Daniel and Felicia as guardians control the funds. Clean. Legal. Unstoppable. Margaret's eyes widened. The baby inherits. Jake cursed under his breath. So, they staged your death not only for your assets, but to funnel everything to a child under their control. Margaret's fists clenched. That baby is innocent. Whoever its parents are, it doesn't deserve to be used as a pawn. Jake leaned back grim. So what's the move? Margaret's voice steadied. Expose them. Publicly. But not until we have undeniable proof. I'll let them bury me in lies a little longer. And then I'll rise from the grave, with the truth in my hands. Jake chuckled low. Now that's a show I'd pay to see. Margaret smiled faintly. Trust me, Jake. They'll be free. And unforgettable. They built their case methodically. Photos, recordings, timelines. Margaret even began drafting her own statement. Her testimony for the day she revealed herself. It has to sound believable, she said. Not like vengeance. Like justice. Jake nodded. And what about Daniel? Her voice cracked but held steady. He chose his path. He stopped being my son the day he pushed me overboard. Silence filled the room, broken only by the scratch of Jake's pen as he noted their evidence. The final piece came unexpectedly. One night, as Jake monitored the marina, he overheard Felicia arguing on the phone. We agreed 6 weeks, not longer. Barnes promised the accounts would be open. Her voice was sharp, panicked. Jake recorded it on his phone. When he replayed it for Margaret, she closed her eyes. That's it, she whispered. Her voice, admitting the scheme. Combined with the documents and Richard's recording, we have them cornered. Her heart pounded with resolve. Time was coming. The day of reckoning began with the will reading. Daniel and Felicia, dressed in solemn black, sat confidently at the lawyer's office, expecting full control. Richard Barnes was there, smug and polished. The lawyer cleared his throat, beginning the proceedings. And then the door opened. Gasps rippled through the room as Margaret stepped inside. Alive, composed, and very much not dead. Sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice cool. But I believe I still have a say in my own estate. Daniel's face went white. Mom. Felicia dropped her pen. Richard's eyes widened, panic flashing before he masked it with a tight smile. This is impossible, Felicia whispered. Margaret laid a thick folder on the table. Not impossible. Inconvenient for you. She glanced at the lawyer. Before you proceed, you might want to hear these recordings. Jake, seated behind her, pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room, damning and undeniable. Felicia's phone call followed. Gasps and whispers filled the air. Margaret looked directly at her son. You pushed me into the ocean, Daniel. You watched as I nearly drowned. You plotted to erase me, to declare me incompetent, to feed lies to anyone who would listen. And for what? Money you never earned. A baby you used as a prop. Daniel stammered. It wasn't like that. Margaret's voice cut like glass. It was exactly like that. And now everyone knows. Richard's mask cracked as the lawyer demanded an explanation. Felicia's eyes filled with fury. The scandal erupted within hours. News outlets swarmed the story. Heiress fakes death, exposes son's plot. Richard was arrested for fraud. Felicia faced charges for attempted murder. Daniel's face haunted every headline. The son who tried to kill his mother. And the baby. Authorities traced custody back to a distant cousin, manipulated into surrendering guardianship. Margaret ensured the child was returned safely. Standing once more in her old home, Margaret felt the weight of betrayal, but also the strength of survival. "They tried to bury me," she whispered. "But I wasn't done living."